I think it started. Usually it says it's recording. So my name is Rob Hayes. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. Um, it's a couple minutes after 11. We'll get started here. Today we have two speakers from our platform management team to talk about something that is obviously very current in today's news. We have two really smart people to talk about two really smart strategies and again, with the issue this in the U.S. in the last week with an oil line going down due to a ransomware attack, I think this stuff is relevant. Lots of companies have software that is nice to have. We believe for your clients this is must-have stuff. So hopefully you can pay attention, learn some things about it, and reach out to your team member and start some discussions with your clients about this, because there's obviously nothing more important than locking down and being able to recover your Active Directory. So without further ado, I'll give you a Brian, or which Brian's kicking off?
Well, probably both of us. So,
okay.
Brian, I'll let you, Mr. Patton, I'll let you go first. Monkey face.
Yeah, I'm Brian Patton out of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I am a generalist dealing with all things Quest with a keen interest in all things security related.
Yeah, and I'm Brian Heimer. I'm a solutions architect with Quest. I've worked for Quest for a little over 20 years, going on to my 21st. And right now I focus on our Active Directory recovery and then compliance solutions for the Microsoft platform.
So I figured we'd start talking about, how people are measuring risk. A lot of organizations are measuring risk, and they utilize like the NIST framework to be able to do so. What's really interesting, this is from the Intel use case about 2014, 2015. If you notice, there's the recovery section down the very bottom. And they're like, hey, do we have policy in place? Can we restore our network? Can we restore our applications? But there's one key thing that I've always found that's missing. Before I can restore the applications or the different data, I must have my identity provider up and running. So for many, many years, people have always assumed that Active Directory, the primary authentication source, is going to be readily available, but many customers have not thoroughly tested out, can they restore their identity provider, which needs to be done prior to restoring your applications, your data, and whatnot. So
yeah, it's very true. I think a lot of companies are still focused, and even today, Brian, I still run into it, where they're focused on the physical disaster, right? Where a data center got wiped out by a hurricane, for example. And that's just not something that should bring Active Directory down, because Active Directory is a multi-master database. You should have domain controllers in different geographic regions of the world. And so, yeah, it was very easy to assume with a physical disaster that, with the right planning at least, that Active Directory would remain up. Not so true with the cyber attacks that we're seeing today.
So a lot of different DR testing people are practicing. They may take an offline copy of a domain controller, but that's not, testing out the scorched earth scenario that we're seeing happen more and more frequently.
True. Next slide.
Yep. So different lessons learned for me. I realized NotPetya happened, 2017, and I took a lot of stuff to heart from that. This is an example from Norsk Hydro. This coincidentally was the day after our disaster recovery edition product came out that this happened. And when I read through this different thread, it really got me thinking, because I learned after the fact with the MER situation that they were still able to communicate because Azure AD and Exchange Online were up and running. But also keep in mind, a lot of different attackers will be seeing what's going on in your different communication strategy. So one of my biggest takeaways is, well, what is your emergency communication strategy where it's isolated and contained, where you aren't giving it away that you've detected that something has happened? Exchange Online is a good backup now, but who's to say they don't have access to your Exchange mailboxes and are watching your emailing back and forth? So it's really something just to ponder. What is my communication plan if AD is down and Exchange Online, maybe they've given themselves permissions? I need to think that through before that disaster strikes.
Yeah, you really do need an alternate communication plan, and that's been really key. I know with some incidents that we've been involved with that IT has been outsourced, that we've actually seen the outsourcing company provide that communication platform, whatever it is, whether it's Teams or WebEx or whatever. So so that, but it is important to have that figured out ahead of time.
Now, the other thing is inventorying what do you have. In Azure Active Directory, it's relatively simple because you can go out here to enterprise applications and identify all the applications they're using Azure AD as the authentication source. So this makes it a lot easier for cloud first. People are doing the zero trust stuff, getting their applications frontlined out here first. But the reality is there's more than just modern applications in most environments. If you look to the on-premises directory, go to the next slide, please. There are still a ton of applications that are binding directly to the directory. So if at all possible, I like to try to rechange that application and have it authenticate to Azure AD versus on-premises AD. That helps the different zero trust mindset, but some applications just won't support it. So identifying and trying to get an inventory as to what's out there can be extremely important. So we do have one tool that can help identify the applications you have, so you can identify that prioritization for recovery. And this is where I do advocate like our AD queries product and change order. Here's an example where I can see that we have our Active Rows product that is out of this origin down the bottom that's doing some different AD queries. So this is just one piece of the puzzle that I like to know before disaster does strike.
Right, and the origins here in the column as well. All of these different queries could be the same application, but taking a look at origin, we probably should have grouped this by origin to really show, to see what other applications might be querying Active Directory for information. At least that's one good thing with Change Auditor for AD queries, where you can get that type of info.
But let's face it, not every instant that occurs is a malicious cyber attack. There are plenty of different changes that happen on a regular interval. So Brian, let's go to the next slide and talk about the most likely things that have been happening in AD for the last 20 years. And object attribute level modification, deletion. Going back to the beginning of AD, human beings are managing the directory and they make mistakes. I know we have a lot of partners on the line that deal with migrations. Maybe they have QMM and does a dir sync and attribute gets messed up. How do you restore down to the attribute level? Some of our partners may not realize this, but our professional services, they will not do a migration without installing our Recovery Manager AD product first. So they have some kind of backup plan in the event that something bad does occur. Go ahead, Brian.
Sorry about that. I just made a human mistake by hitting the wrong button on my mouse. So just a great example. Brian, there was quite a few years ago, there was a bug that was found in 2008 R2, or maybe it was 2012, where a site was modified, a subnet was modified that had already been entered, an IPv6 subnet, and it was modified wrong, and the value that was put in was wrong. And that actually caused a forced disaster because that error replicated to other DCs. And when the KCC got a hold of that invalid IPv6 address, it didn't know what to do and it just crashed. So when the KCC crashes, the server reboots.
Yep.
So so that replicated out to 33 domain controllers through a state, and they had to do a forced recovery to get past that. Now, when they figured out what went wrong, and they went and talked to Microsoft, Microsoft said, well, you can't enter an invalid IPv6 address. We check that before it goes in. So you can't enter something like that. And he said, well, I didn't really enter it. I modified an existing one. And they went, oh, okay. And they had to go fix that. But what's interesting to me is a lot of those checks and balances in Active Directory are handled through the GUI. So a proper malicious person could still make that type of attack by bypassing the GUI and writing directly to the DIT. That's a danger spot to me, and that's another reason it's not just human error, but it's malicious attack that could cause that type of problem.
Well, in going to group policies, people make accidental mistakes all the time. There's no really good version control system. We do have other products around that, but we can also restore to a previous state whenever we did the backup. And the other topic that we're seeing more often is with this big rush to zero trust, working from home, people are doing conditional access policies. and oops, we have the wrong setting configured there. It's no longer working. How do we reassociate all of that? So we're seeing those as the more likely scenarios we're seeing in 2021.
Right. And I keep on hitting my right arrow key and it's not working right. So let's do that. Okay.
So let's talk about what's natively available, the AD object lifecycle with no recycle bin. So going back to Windows Server 2000, we've been able to restore objects in attributes. And the key thing I want to focus on is attributes. Just because, I mean, in all essence, I want to try to prevent a cyber attack from happening. But in reality, I do a lot of our security assessments. I've seen passwords that are older than my, grown son. I saw a last password change for an administrator account in 1999 because I did an in-place upgrade from NT4L to Active Directory. And I asked him, why haven't you changed that password? Well, we're afraid that stuff's going to break. So wouldn't it be great if you could actually restore just that password as thing did break, so you can actually increase your security posture quite a bit? And
yeah,
we get
natively you
that built
can't
to
do
be able to
that.
do that.
Yeah, natively you can't do that, Brian. It's not there, but you're right. We have the ability to restore passwords and SID history. So imagine if you were still relying on SID history and the source domain was down. The source forest that you got that SID history from was gone. There's no way to replace SID history on those objects natively. So you could really break things if an account got deleted, if you didn't have the recycle bin and those attributes weren't there anymore. Because even though they're in the backup, there is no native API to restore passwords or SID history.
So, Brian, not everybody has money to buy tools. So what can you do natively? Can you explain what that process looks like right now when you delete an object?
Yeah, there are actually some registry keys that you could set, or actually schema changes that you could set so that those attributes are stored on the tombstone object. So you can do that if you wanted to do that. We've had sort of a back and forth argument with Microsoft about whether that's a good thing to do or not, because they think that those are, security sensitive attributes. And so for a long time before the recycle bin came out, they would say, well, listen, you shouldn't keep those on a tombstone object because they're security sensitive, and it's just not smart to do. And then they came out with the recycle bin, and guess what? They keep all those attributes. So it was kind of the pot calling the kettle black to us when they did that. Let's talk about AD object lifecycle though, and understand, what happens to an object through the lifecycle it has within Active Directory. So we'll start with a live object, right? A user, a group, computer, really any object in AD. Every AD object has attributes, and many attributes have values. For example, object name, department, etc. Now, when you delete an object, several things happen, but the object is not actually deleted for quite some time. First, the is deleted attribute is set to true, right? And then the object is moved into the deleted objects container, and the RDN of the object is changed to the object's name and then an OADL with a GUID, right? Most attributes are removed. There's only some very important attributes that are kept on the object, and the last known parent attribute on the object is changed to the distinguished name of the parent container that had the object before. So the object's now called a tombstone. And after this happens, a background process will come in and remove any linked attributes from the object. Those are things like group memberships or managed by or things like that. The object remains in that tombstone state for what's called the tombstone lifetime. That's typically a period of 60 or 180 days. This is to allow replication of that object's new state to fully propagate within the forest, even if a DC is left offline for an extended period of time. So during tombstone lifetime, an object can be reanimated or restored back to a live object. If you have a backup in AD, all the attributes of that object can be restored as well. The method to do this natively is pretty complex. Remember, you used to have to shut down a DC, change it in reboot it into DSRM, restore the entire database in non-authoritative mode. I know a lot of people in Windows 2000 made that mistake of restoring it all authoritatively. And then go mark what you want to restore as authoritative and then reboot back into normal mode. Really a pain. Let's see, where am I? So once the tombstone lifetime is reached, a garbage collection process happens. right? The garbage collection process will physically delete that object um, and make sure that it's completely gone from the directory. And apart from that, the garbage collection process cleans up any white space in the directory. So once an Active Directory object is physically deleted, it no longer exists, right? That also means you can't reanimate or restore it, even if you have a backup that still has that object in it. Now, why is that? Well, it's because of the RID. Microsoft keeps very strict control over RIDs. So they don't allow you to write a RID back into the database. Once they've deleted it, it's lost forever. One other comment I wanted to make is that, yeah, when you restore that object, it's very complex, but that's the beauty of Recovery Manager, right? Because it can restore the object with no downtime. So.
And Brian, just to note, the Tombstone lifetime, it will vary based upon when the AD was initially created. If they started Windows Server 2000 for their directory, that default value is 60 days. So people that actually started going back 21 years ago, like, hey, check out what that value is. If you're going to be like most organizations, you can manually change that to 180 days as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's pretty easy to check. I guess I could in the chat later put what the command is that you can run just to see what your Tombstone lifetime is. It's pretty easy. Of course, everything changed with the recycle bin. So let's walk through this once more with the recycle bin considered, right? We start with that live object again. When you delete the object, the isDeleted attribute is still set to true, but there's a new flag called isRecycled, right? Which is set to false. The object is still moved into the deleted objects container just like before, but the attributes are not stripped from it. Now the object is in a deleted state. And in this state, nearly all attributes are preserved on the object. The object remains in this state for the deleted object lifetime, which by default will match the Tombstone lifetime, 60 or 180 days, typically. During this time, that object can be restored back to a live object. And since all the attributes are preserved, there's no need for an Active Directory backup. Now, how easy this is depends on your version of Active Directory. But one good thing is that no downtime is required for the DC. Server 2008 R2 requires using PowerShell to do this, but they introduced a GUI in Server 2012 for restoring objects. In either case, you still need to know which objects you need to restore. There isn't any way to kind of compare and see what you need to restore. I guess you could go browse the deleted objects container. But after that deleted object lifetime expires, the object changes to a, quote, recycled state. Recycled object is very similar to a Tombstone object. Most attributes and linked attributes are removed from the object at this time. Now, recycled objects remain in that state for the recycled object lifetime before they are physically deleted. This uses that Tombstone lifetime value in AD. However, Microsoft does not recommend restoring an object once it reaches the recycled state. Now, I'm not really sure why they don't recommend that. We've actually done it. It hasn't caused any harm that we've seen. But that's the recommendation from Microsoft, is not to restore those. Once that recycled object lifetime expires, the garbage collection process runs and the object is physically deleted and lost forever.
And we still have plenty of customers that do not use the recycle bin. So Mike, I saw your question. I don't have a percent at all, but when you actually enable the recycle bin, it's permanent action. There's more stuff replicated. So there's some reasons why some people don't even want to enable the recycle bin, especially if they have a tool like ours.
Right. And then I've got other customers that say, well, why would I need a product like Recovery Manager if I have the recycle bin? And the answer there is really around, what is it that you're recovering? There's still group policy objects. The AD recycle bin does nothing for group policy objects. There's still exactly, Brian, there's still the attribute argument, right? So let's say I'm introducing a meta directory to my environment and I run a script, or the meta directory runs a script and changes some form of critical attribute. It could be email address, it could be group membership, it could be managed by attributes or employee ID attributes, or whatever within the directory. And it has just messed everything up. Nothing got deleted. Recycle bin's no help at all. Right. So with Recovery Manager, I can go compare that specific attribute across my directory, see where it's changed, and restore the original attribute from the backup. There's still a great deal of value there just for standard Recovery Manager.
So the recycle bin, this actually got added, was it what, 2008, Brian, with the GUI, or was it 2012?
The 2012 is when the recycle bin came in.
So
the
you
GUI.
can view it via the Active Directory Administrative Center, but like Brian just mentioned, you can't do attributes. You can't just do the password or the set history. And dealing with migrations or lots of different change, there's still a whole bunch of value with just the base RMAD that we've been providing for many years.
Yeah.
In addition to that, next slide is the group policies. So you could manually back those up. I like being able to automatically do that. It just makes things a lot simpler.
Yeah, and there's two things that we've talked about, Brian, with group policy, right? Change Auditor has the ability to lock down group policy, right? So that
Yep.
normal users or even users with native authority aren't allowed to make changes to GPOs. That to me is a huge advantage right now because a lot of ransomware we're seeing is using group policy to propagate. So if you can lock down those changes, that's great.
We are in a hybrid world, so go to the next one. And we are seeing a lot of stuff around conditional access policies. So a lot of the if-then statements, if this thing happens, do this. Now, what's interesting, you can see that sales group by the highlighter that Brian has right there. That group originated from on-premises. So a lot of our customers don't realize this thing ever happens on premises and that group gets modified, taken out of scope and whatnot. This association that you have right here will be lost. So all of a sudden you made the change, even though you restore that change on premises, like if you knew it, all these different settings here will not be coming back. And we'll see this happen more frequently.
Yeah, so the object, the sales object, let's say that got deleted on premises, you restore it on premises, it will sync back up to Azure AD, but this type of information, these conditional access policies, will not come back. So if I was locking down access to multi-factor through group membership, that's not there anymore, and people can log in with just a password, right? And you can see the other options here. So the Azure AD recycle bin doesn't take care of these things. And that's another big misnomer. People think a recycle bin, you can pull everything out of the recycle bin, and you really can't.
But this is the stuff that's been going on for the last 20 plus years. Beginning like in 2017, for me personally, is really when I saw a lot more of the different ransomware attacks that where the host operating system is getting affected as well. Last year, here's an example from the Carlson Wagonlit. They ended up paying $4.5 million. What's interesting about this, they originally started off with an asking price of $10 million. So if you are hit and you decide that you want to pay, remember that you can negotiate. Absolutely critical. It's really interesting, the dialogue that was captured there. What we're noticing, though, there was the FireEye report that came out just a few weeks ago, and they're mentioning all the different challenges in restoring domain controllers. And one thing I noted in here as well is the corruption of sysvol. Brian's been dealing with some customers that had the scorched earth scenario happening to them. I actually was dealing with another customer that just sent me a thank you for having their product because somebody affected their sysvol, and they're able to use our product to get their sysvol directory back up and running and use it to restore it. So there's lots of different scenarios that you have to practice that are starting to happen a lot more frequently.
I still want to know what happened to those guys natively because they tried a native restore first and sysvol just emptied out again. Native restore is, restore sysvol to the PDC emulator and wait for replication. Not the greatest answer when you've got a really big forest. So our solution actually restores sysvol non-authoritatively on every single domain controller. And that minimizes that replication storm and gets you back up and running a lot quicker. So yeah, they were singing our song for sure.
And then, top of the news this week, Colonial Pipeline, we're seeing it happen a lot more. There's all kinds of different ransomware mitigation, recovery, and all the guidance I've seen is there is never a clear way to 100% effectively prevent it from happening because we don't know about the next 0 day that's going to happen. So with that said, if you haven't tested out your recovery plan, please do. If you don't have one, create one and test out for different scenarios. And most importantly, today, get an offline copy of your backups. Your systems stay, offline in immutable storage somehow. Some of my customers, they are outsourcing that where somebody else is going to store that data. Check those SLAs as well. One of the customers we had last year, they had like a 72-hour SLA to be able to get their data back. But if you truly are down, maybe 72 hours is a little bit too long. So we want to reanalyze some of those different offline backups you have as well.
And defense in depth is a really important thing. And as much as I love our product and I know what our product does, I would never tell people to stop doing like native system state backups. I still think that plays a very vital role. And our tool is focused on Active Directory. If your client is using your domain controllers for something more than just Active Directory, you're going to want to make sure that you're taking system state or bare metal backups of those machines. We do bare metal backups too, though, so you can use us for that.
And just to be clear, I saw a question in the chat. RMAD's great, but they were not sure about the capability for RMAD for Azure AD. Our base RMAD does not do Azure AD. Our on-demand recovery, our SaaS tool, does the Azure AD and can actually talk back to RMAD for all those different associations that happen from something that did originate on premises. So there
for
is
hybrid accounts. Yeah.
So RMAD, 20 years we've been doing this or longer, right?
Yeah. It came out in 2000. Yeah. So I'm just going to walk through. There's 3 different editions of RMAD, and I want to make sure that it's clear, at least at a high level, what the differences are. So we started with this one in 2000. We did automatic backups, right? We do comparison reporting, but the big thing that made this product sell was that ability to restore objects in Active Directory without having to bring a domain controller down to get the job done. So that was our big seller. These other things kind of came up along the lines. We do that for Active Directory and group policy, so comparison reporting, and of course backups take care of all of that. And we added Active Directory, or sorry, ADAM or ADLDS databases as well. You can back those up and restore objects individually and granularly with Recovery Manager. But around 2006, Microsoft came out with a white paper, and the paper was called Planning for Active Directory Forest Recovery. And in that document, the premise was, if something happened to the directory itself and it became corrupt, and that corruption replicated to all of your DCs, and the result of that corruption was that users couldn't authenticate, that applications like Exchange, which was still really big back then, that those stopped responding because Active Directory wasn't responding. What would you do? And then it took that document. It set up for you to prepare for that type of disaster. And then in the appendix of the document, it walked through the actual recovery process. What we did with Forest Edition is we took that document and we automated it. And I'll go into some more detail on that in another slide. And then over time, we had a lot of customers that said, hey, we love what your product does, but we can't just test it against a forest we stood up with no accounts in it. We need to look at testing it against production, but we can't really do that. We took that to heart, and we built this feature we call Active Directory Virtual Lab. And so it can create a copy of Active Directory in an isolated VM host so that you can test your forest recovery process. And we actually found that a lot of clients wanted that for a lot of other testing, like an application upgrade or maybe a schema upgrade, to see how that would affect their production AD before actually doing it in production.
Or even like identity management deployments, testing that different type of stuff out off of exact replicas versus a mimicked built example that does not look like your production AD at all.
Great example, Brian. There's a lot of reasons. We had people that wanted the virtual lab feature alone and could care less about forest recovery, although we always sold it with forest recovery. And then we also added some rudimentary forest health. Now we have another product called Active Directory AD Health that probably goes a lot deeper in watching the health of your Active Directory than this does, but it's a nice feature added within the tool. But that Microsoft document, over the last 13, 14 years now, it's gone through at least a dozen revisions as new OS versions came out. Mm-hmm. And as the focus changed, right? Because it used to be just directory level corruption is what they looked at. Over time, that started to move, further into like the operating system, obviously with ransomware. And so around 2014 is when I remember seeing the first ransomware attack hit DCs. And 2017 was really a bad year, right? We had WannaCry. WannaCry did a lot of damage, like the the National Institute of Health in Ireland got hit with the WannaCry virus, and it actually did somewhere around $4 billion worth of damage around the U.S. There's a great story about a guy named Marcus Hutchins. Write that name down and look him up if you haven't. He actually stopped that virus, and I don't think it was because he was super smart. He was pretty smart, but he was also very lucky. The great story anyway.
Yeah, he got arrested later, and he's since been released.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. Yeah, he had a sort of checkered childhood. He's a good guy. So we knew we had to up the game, and so we came out with OS level recovery and what we called the disaster recovery edition of the product. And today we do OS level recovery in two ways. We do bare metal, and we're not doing anything real special there. We're using native tools to make bare metal backups and then restore bare metal. We do automate a bit of that process in creating the Windows recovery environment images that you need, and then managing that through our Force Recovery Console. But we also do another recovery called CleanOS. Yeah, Brian,
let's talk about OS recovery for just a minute, because a lot of people think they have that covered with their traditional backup vendors. Oh, let's put the AD back on top of that. I used to think like that. Why is that not a suitable way to do it?
Yeah, so especially if you have to change hardware, there's a lot that changes within the backups that that you can't just flip that over. Even with our tool, if you do a bare metal recovery, you'd have to set up drivers for your new hardware in the Windows RE image so that they can be carried through and applied to that backup once the restore operation is done. So that's painful. CleanOS recovery is very different, though. What we do with CleanOS recovery is we strictly take Active Directory components and restore those back to the server. So, and I don't know if I have a slide that goes into that detail more, but the problem with doing that, if you try to do it natively, is that there's differences in GUIDs. Anytime you create a new domain controller, the GUIDs that are part of the Forest ID, the domain ID, the DC's identification are different, even if you gave them the same names. And so if you tried to say you took a server, you promoted it with the same Forest domain and DC name as the original, as what's in your backup, and then you restored the backup onto that server. Because those GUIDs are different, the server will just blue screen when you boot it back into normal mode. So we figured out how to fix that little problem. And so it's a great feature if you think the OS has been compromised, or you think there might be some sort of malicious code on a server. We can restore just Active Directory to a wholly new server, which is a really great piece.
And I used to have some customers, they would say, yeah, we have VM. We'll just go back to a snapshot. I had a customer do that last year, and they caused all kinds of USN rollback issues. And they ended up having to completely dump their directory and do a migration because it was so inconsistent with which accounts had what passwords and whatnot. It was a mess.
I had another one that did that, and I think the snap must have been really old because they had to unjoin and rejoin servers to the domain. And it's almost like they had dug a hole by reverting to snap, and now they were just digging themselves into a deeper hole. And the problem is that the DIT file is not just for that domain, right? It contains nodes that have to do with every domain in the forest. And so the problems in that DIT that were forest-wide problems started replicating out to other domains in the forest, and the problem just got worse. So reverting it from snap is not a smart idea. So, but the great thing about this is with either of our recovery solution or recovery methods, you can restore to different hardware. And with CleanOS recovery, it doesn't even matter if you want to restore out to the cloud. You can do that. You can restore Active Directory and use cloud images in Azure or AWS or GCP. And yes, we've done all three, and recover to there. So you don't even need the infrastructure on premises to get Active Directory back up and running.
And kind of a leading question, what point do we go back to?
Yeah, great question. You always want to go back to something before the disaster happened. And a lot of incident response work has to do with doing that. And that's one of the reasons why CleanOS is such a great example too, because even if you can't get that far back, or it would be too costly to go that far back, you can at least clear the operating system, right? The other thing we did is we added malware scanning. And Right now we use Windows Defender, and I think we have Norton Antivirus and Technical Preview. We're not the antivirus experts. We're going to lean on those AV experts to do this. We plan on doing McAfee in the future, probably 10.3 or 10.4. We're on 10.1.1 right now. But that's another big piece, because the one piece of Active Directory that might still contain bad data is, or malicious code, is your sysvol. So being able to scan that is really important.
And we got to go a little bit faster, Brian.
All right, so malware detection, I just talked about that, so I'll just go ahead and skip by this slide. There are several different modes of recovery. There's forest recovery, there's single domain recovery, there's sysvol recovery, and then there's this repromotion. We added this in 10.1. It allows us to do recovery in phases. So you don't have to bring the entire forest back up. You have to bring at least one DC per domain up first. So in my example here, just pretend that these triangles are not domains, but they're Active Directory sites. Okay, and so I have an Americas site that's rather large. I have headquarters. I'm going to say headquarters is on Balmoral Island in the Bahamas. You guys were here at the start of the call, you'll know. But if I'm doing this, I'll just grab a pen real quick. If I'm doing recovery on phase 1, I have to restore at least one DC per domain from backup. So let's say one of my domains isn't in headquarters, but it's in my United States data center. So my phase 1 recovery would have to include all the DCs here, at least one DC in my United States data center, and then the DCs for at least one DC per domain in headquarters. So that's phase 1, right? Phase 2 then could be everything that's left, right? So it could be all of this, right? That could be phase 2, but it doesn't have to be phase 2. I could break this up, because I can actually run phase 2. And again, phase 2 is really just promoting servers back into the environment to take place of DCs that you did not restore from backup. So phase 2 I could follow the sun. So let's see, this happened noon Eastern time. So Asia is going to be on next. So I'll run phase 2 again. I'll call it phase 3, but it's really just phase 2 a second time to get my Asia servers up. And then as my European guys finish their beauty rest and they get back online and get some servers ready for me, I can run phase 4 and promote servers back into EMEA as well.
Now, before we get to this phase 2, I mean, I would urge you to talk to your customers and ask who has the authority to decide that you're going to be doing the recovery. There's a lot of human factors and human consulting that still needs to happen here. I believe in the situation that you were helping out with, Brian, they
last month
want to make a decision.
Yeah, they kind of had to get wrangled into getting someone with authority within the company to say, okay, we're pulling the trigger, right? We're shutting down they were hobbling along on domain controllers that were partially infected. And we had to have someone pull the trigger and say, okay, we are shutting down those domain controllers because we're in recovery operations now. We need to get back up to a normal state.
And so, how long did it take when we actually restored that first DC? I think we did clean OS, right?
Yeah, it took 36 minutes to an hour. I was actually asleep. It happened about 1 o'clock, 1:30 in the afternoon. And I had been working night shifts with them to get back up. When we did the first phase 2 for them, we only did it to one other DC, but that recovery took 12 minutes. And then we ran a second phase 2 and hit DCs on 2 different continents, and that took 36 minutes to finish. So recovery methods, we talked about this, right? We've got, where'd my mouse go? Come here, mouse. I'll go back to my laser pen. We've got, the restore from Active Directory from backup. This is the Forest Edition restore. So this is just the DIT file on a healthy OS. We have the Clean OS recovery I just talked about in some detail. And we have bare metal Active Directory recovery. And then these two methods, reinstall and install AD, have to do with the repromotion phases, if you would. If I did phase 2s, those are the two options I have. I could also force uninstall Active Directory and leave that DC out of the forest. Or if I knew that that domain controller was completely gone, I had no physical way to get a replacement server there, I can change him to do not recover. And then he'll get cleaned out of the directory. I can also decide with a little check mark, I can decide to keep that DC in my recovery project if I want to come back and run a phase 2 on him later. So that's kind of how the product works there. Another feature we recently added is the ability to reset the password for every privileged account. and we pick the 9 built-in accounts that are privileged accounts in Active Directory. If you have a user that's a member of more than one of these, they'd get the highest one in the list. They'd get that password. And again, you'd reset these passwords so nobody knows what their password is. And then as people needed access, you'd go manually reset for each one of them. But only the person running the recovery operation and entering these passwords would know what they are. The beauty of Recovery Manager is it lets you monitor the progress of every DC from a centralized console. And that took a lot of stress out when we were doing a recovery test years ago. We went into a company that set up and did a manual recovery, 4 DCs, 3 domains. They took about 6.5 hours of heads down work for 2 of their guys to get that recovery process done in the test. We came in with Recovery Manager set up and took backups, and our recovery process took 28 minutes and 56 seconds. And I have a screenshot of that somewhere. But the beauty of that was not just the time, but while recovery was running, we all just sat around in a circle and talked about upcoming summer vacations, where our kids are going to go to college, sort of the philosophy of forced recovery. And then we'd look over and we go, oh, look, it's almost done with the restore from backup stage. It's moving into configure. Now tell me again, what's your kid going to major in? That's pretty cool, right? And it was just totally relaxed.
And that's important to know too, Brian, because if a disaster strikes your customer, they're going to be in an emotional mindset. This is where partners are extremely important, because you're going to be able to talk with more logic because you aren't as emotionally invested in the environment. So this is a real need, because we're seeing these attacks happen a lot more frequently. We need logical, rational mindsets to help our customers get through this different process.
And people under stress make mistakes. And so automating these processes and everything here in this configure stage of our recovery process is what Microsoft put in that document I talked about earlier. Things like raising the RID pool, seizing FSMA roles, cleaning up the metadata of DCs you're not restoring, resetting the Kerberos account, trust account, and if you noticed on the previous screen, the computer account passwords for every DC twice. And that way, any DC that wasn't part of your recovery process that might still be online can't talk to the recovered forest.
Just a call out here too. Microsoft recommends that, or not Microsoft, but like you're in the government and whatnot, it's a STIG finding if you don't change out the KRBTG password every 180 days. And it's interesting, a lot of my customers, I've done security assessments, some of them have never done it because those best practices have changed. So you may even want to look at your customers, when's the last time that password was changed? Don't change it fast in consecutive order, but there's a Microsoft script. Make sure you run that as an admin, and that'll actually check to make sure replication happens. But it's something you can probably do to kind of prevent some stuff from happening in the first place.
Well, Brian, I heard a rumor a long time ago, and I know I've been trying to figure out if it's true or not. I heard a rumor that in Windows 2000, the original KRBTGT password was only 3 characters long. And I've been trying to get a copy of 2000 up somewhere, just not even with a service pack that I can go check that on, and I haven't been able to find one. But that would be a really interesting thing to figure out. Another thing our product does is it gives you the chance to not only write a recovery plan, which we can see here. I can see how many DCs do I have per domain, how many do I plan to recover, what sites do I have, and just what steps are done or what roles do those servers have. There's about 3 pages to this report. Depending on how many DCs you have a lot and be longer. But having that plan, we can export this out to a Word document, and you can bring it into your own corporate documentation. After the recovery is done, you can run a report that looks very similar to this, and it'll show you any errors that were run into during the recovery process and how long it took and all of that. So that's really great. For diagnosing and managing, we have these options put in where you can check your forest health, and we have 4 different tests that we do. We check accessibility, replication, trust relationships, that those are working properly. And then we create a user account, log on with that account, and then delete the account on each DC. And what that does is it makes sure the authentication is working, the global catalog is working, because you can't finish a logon without a global catalog. And your RID master is working because we created that account, and so we must have gotten a RID. So those are nice features to have. On the diagnose side, that's great, but on the manage side, we actually give you the ability to manage the force recovery agents, change FSMA roles between DCs, reset global catalog servers, change DNS client settings, or even purge Kerberos service tickets. If they're less than 10 hours old, you might need to do that after recovery because those previous tickets would no longer be valid because a KRB TGT password changed twice. So you can do that manually inside of the tool. And we can even reset the DSRM password on all of your DCs from the console, which is really nice. So how long should we hold on to backups, Brian?
Well, depends on what kind of backup it is. But like the Tombstone, if it's 180 days, there's no reason to keep it longer than 180 days.
Right, exactly. So Tombstone lifetime is typically 60 or 180 days. It depends on what version of Active Directory, what version of Windows you were on when you made your Active Directory Forest. If you haven't gone and changed this manually, you can change the value to whatever you want, actually. But 2000, 2003, or 2003 R2 was up to SP1 was 60 days. And then 2003 SP1 or 2, or 2003 R2 SP2, or 2008 and above, those were all 180 days. So most object level disasters happen within the first 2 weeks, but it's still prudent to retain backups up to the Tombstone lifetime, right? And so that's what we usually recommend. For object level recovery, we do daily backups the first 2 weeks, and then we switch to a weekly backup out to the Tombstone lifetime, right? So if you did that, here's sort of a calculation. Say you did 2 DCs per domain. This is how many backups you would have. And you're welcome to take a screenshot of that if you like. This is a really good example for backup retention. And most of my clients follow this advice. So I'll just pause for a little bit and move to the next slide. As far as storage goes, estimating the size requires knowing the current size of your NTDS and SysVol. So we compress backups by default, and variable conditions in AD can drastically affect the size of your backups. So the best way to know your backup size is to use Recovery Manager and create backups yourself, and then extrapolate those results by multiplying by the number of backups you plan to retain. If you need to estimate space required without creating sample backups, then this table can help, right? If I have the size of my NTDS for each domain and my SysVol for each domain, I combine that, and then I compress. I think I did a 60% compression on the example, right? And then of course you can figure out your estimates after that.
And CleanOS is a lot better than the BMR as far as size as well. Just saying the obvious.
Yeah, the RMAD backup, the RMAD standard backup that we use for CleanOS is always compressed. Bare metal backups, I checked even within Quest because we use our own tools. Our bare metal backups are 43 times larger in disk space than our RMAD standard backups. So wow. Yeah, it's a great space savings. If you're curious, if you have a customer that has Recovery Manager today, I can take their backup catalog information and pop it into a spreadsheet and give them a little bit of information as far as, you know, size and how much space they're taking and what's worthwhile and what's not worthwhile to keep. You can see this example. There were hundreds of backups that were over that 180-day limit that they could have just cleaned out and saved a lot of space. So if you have a customer and you wanted to do that, it's a pretty quick thing for me to do. Just contact me and I can do that for you. Oh, and I did talk about recovering to the cloud earlier, and that you could actually do CleanOS recovery to the cloud. Today, you'd kind of have to manage part of it. You'd have to provide those instances, those blank machines that you'd want to do the promotion and recovery to. In the future, we plan to change that where you would give Recovery Manager the management API to your cloud service provider, and then we would create those images for you. But that's not something we're doing today. Brian, I think that's the end of our slide deck.
Yeah, go to the next one. That we have a commercial out there. We do have our tech coming up later. Feel free to register. Registration is now open. It's free to all. Feel free to let your customers know about it as well. This year we have Alex Simons, Jeffrey Snover as our keynotes. I know Paula Janikowski's out there. She'll be doing a session. I believe Sean Metcalf still is, and many other of the normal people. And Brian, I do see a question in the chat from Mike around risks and what certifications does RMED DRE to help gain and reduce risk for organizations. And it's not really reducing the risk, because risk is, a weakness and somebody's taking advantage of the weakness. It's really remediation in the event that you are definitely affected. So I just want to make sure that nomenclature is clear. But if that is the case, we can definitely help automate your RTO and your RPO for whatever it is once you decide the disaster has happened and we need to be able to do the restoration. So my guidance, the NIST cybersecurity framework as an example, is a voluntary framework and you can deviate it how you need. My guidance is add an authentication column to make sure you've tested out all of those different things. So it's not really doing a certification in that regard. There's no certification to do. If you're thinking about like FIPS 140-2, we are following FIPS 140-2, encryption algorithms. We have all that type of stuff, but it doesn't really make much sense from a certification perspective as far as to get like common criteria or like that, because we aren't really meeting those sort of protection profiles. So I hope that answered your question. Go ahead, Brian.
And Brian, I just wanted to comment in there too that, we are focused on Active Directory recovery with this tool. Quest has a data protection division where we can back up and restore everything, even other platforms than Windows. That's a different business unit within Quest, and they're very successful with their NetVault and their core store solutions and rapid recovery. Those are really good tools for that. But when it comes to Active Directory, one of the other things that a lot of people overlook is a lot of compliance regulations tell you to test your Active Directory, or to test your recovery operations at least annually. Mm-hmm. And Recovery Manager helps you do that. So it's a big advantage there as well, because I talk to so many clients and they go, oh yeah, we usually just we spin up a few extra DCs and we move them into our DR site, and then we isolate them and cease FSMA roles, and then those guys can do their disaster recovery testing. And I said, well, did you ever disaster recovery test AD? And they're like, what? Why would I need to do that? Well, with us, you can do that process, and you could start by doing that process into your DR center, and then you've finished your Active Directory recovery testing, and they can go ahead with theirs.
And the one thing I want to point out, there's a ton of backup vendors, and they have Active Directory as a checkbox, but they're restoring AD like they would data. It's not the same. It's not doing all the different things, raising the RID pool, changing the KRTG password, all those other different things. So here's a lot of different differentiators that you would have to do. If not, you can actually cause more different havoc in doing that different type of restoration.
Even though some rollback issues, RID reuse.
Doesn't mean it's actually going to do it. And if you think that you are covered with those, please test it out. Don't just test it on the same hardware that you were using. Try it out in a new box, because it's very unlikely maybe that there's a rootkit on that different hardware. You're gonna have to go to a brand new computer. Test out those different scenarios. Test out different scenarios and practice.
Yeah. There's a few musings that came from one of our Microsoft MVPs, a former employee, and one of them was, Active Directory forest recovery is hard. Communication and coordination is even harder. If you have an Active Directory forest that's a multi-domain forest, the difficulty level is 5 times as complex. If you have multiple sites, especially geographically dispersed, say across a continent or across the world, that's 5 times as complex to recover. So keep those in mind when you're doing Active Directory recovery. Go back to our last slide here.
And I do see one other question around Quest products in a consulting environment and licensing. And I know we do have some NFR keys for partners to be able to use. But any of those different questions, they can probably go to Robert Hayes directly, and maybe we can kind of collaborate and figure out if there's anything else that's intended to be able to help out there. But this is a stats slide. These are latest stats. All of them, I think, are within the last month or so that have come out.
Yeah, and they're all from 2020 and 2021.
The one interesting thing that really sticks out here, 34% of those that paid a ransom failed to get their data back. So a lot of different attacks, they're exfiltrating data first so they can kind of do that extortion. But even the ones that are paying the ransom, they're not getting their data back, or they're not able to recover it because they aren't getting their different keys. So this is why it's vital to not rely on cyber insurance. In fact, there was a French organization for insurance, and they've decided that if it's ransomware payments, they're not paying out anymore.
Yeah,
So just because you have cyber insurance doesn't mean it's going to pay out.
it's true. And I know when we talk to companies and we hear from other consulting groups that, hey, I'm looking at some companies that got hit and 2 months down the road, they're still rebuilding. I mean, it's devastating. But having Active Directory is just a stone in the bridge you're rebuilding, so to speak. But it's a keystone, right? Without Active Directory, access to all your applications, all of your files and folders, all your databases, all of that can be gone. And that's not a level of access that you want to lose. Active Directory is a very important component in recovery. So.
And ideally, from our partners that are out there, I would love to have more partners that are constantly going out to their customers and help them practice on a regular interval and help them do these different tabletop exercises, remove this different person from it. Because in their time of crisis, they're going to be in an emotional mindset. So they have something they can call on to. There's a lot of real revenue to be made as well. If they are in fact affected, we can get their directory back up and running pretty quickly, but there's still a lot of other stuff that need to be recovered as well.
Yeah, but I can tell you, just in the one that we had last month, when we got AD back up and running, you could feel the stress level on the call start to dissipate because they knew they didn't have that hurdle to conquer anymore. It was a huge deal. So thanks for your time, guys. Brian, any?
Yeah, that's it.
Thoughts?
Robert, do you have any final parting thoughts?
No, hey, thanks guys very much for delivering this presentation. If anyone who's on the call wants to hear more or wants us to elaborate more on a specific feature that we went through today, we're happy to do that. Obviously, this is a current and relevant topic. So if your customers are starting to ask you how to best address some of these issues with AD, please let us know. We're happy to do whether it's for your team or whether it's for your customer. That's what we're here for. Brian and Brian, thank you very much for doing this. It's been a great hour. We're gonna end up right here. I'm gonna stop the recording. I will send the recording out to everybody who's on the call or was invited. And again, if to generate some questions, please let us know, and we're happy to do this over again. Thanks everyone for your time. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Cheers.